Hi everyone. So I think we will get going. We're actually just waiting for Alexi to join the line, so hopefully he'll be joining over the next few moments as well. But if not, we will just kick off without him. So for a brief introduction, I'm Emily Havers, and I'll be hosting this webinar on behalf of ESG VC today. So over the next 45 minutes or so, this fantastic panel and I are going to be discussing carbon accounting. So really getting to grips with sort of why companies should be thinking about monitoring their emissions, how to actually go about getting the data, and then what to do once this has been gathered. So to dive in, really excited to have hopefully three fantastic panelists joining me. Here at the moment, we have Kerrigan, COO of Moneybox, who are now on their 5th year of being a carbon neutral company. And also Rowena Humphreys, an independent sustainability consultant. And hopefully when Alexis joins, for context, he's co-founder and CEO of Greenly, which is a platform that aims to make carbon accounting more accessible to all businesses. So before we get in, I've just seen Alexis join now, so that's fantastic. Kind of quickly before we get into the main webinar itself, a few housekeeping bits and pieces. So we will have time at the end for a Q&A, so please drop any questions into the Q&A box here. And also a quick note to any VC firms on the call, please do take some time at the end to fill out our investor survey. So we at ESG VC have launched this for the first time this year. And it's a super quick survey, but it's really fundamental in allowing us to better understand what the wider VC and investor sentiment is around sustainability and ESG more broadly. So kicking off to the webinar itself, I guess kind of starting at the very basics, and Alexi, coming to you, I did quickly intro you before you joined. Maybe if you could just detail sort of what is carbon accounting and why do companies, really irrespective of their size, need to be thinking about this?
Yeah, so again, thanks so much, Emily. Very happy to be here with all of you, and sorry for having 2 minutes delay here. But carbon accounting, like financial accounting, is essentially the act of providing a detailed account of your CO2 equivalent emissions, meaning not just carbon dioxide, but any greenhouse gas that a company emits. It's essentially an act that of disclosure of emissions along standardized frameworks that mandate companies to report emissions on, maybe people know this already, but I'll repeat it briefly, on 3 scopes, meaning your direct emissions, what your company emits through its company-owned machines, so the stuff that comes out of your factory or your cars, basically. So that's scope 1, your direct emissions. And then there are the indirect emissions, because as a business to operate, you use electricity, you do business with utilities, you have suppliers, you buy goods and services, and so on and so forth. And so while the greenhouse gas are not coming out of your company operations, the fact that you are creating business for these companies is indirectly responsible for these emissions. And so that's basically what you call your scope 2. So when you consume energy, so electricity or urban heating, the utilities will burn either fuel or uranium, or they be linked to, and so the nature, how much you consume energy and who you consume energy with is responsible for your emissions. And scope 3 is everything else. So it's your supply chain mostly, but it's also the usage of your product. So to give you a brief example, when you consume tea, so the major 80% of the emissions of tea are happening when you boil the water to make tea, because you use a lot of energy to heat the water. So it's not actually in the tea itself, it's linked to the usage of the product. So that's your scope 3. So anyway, I could go on for a while, but basically that's the standard. And then different government mandate you to report this, sometimes just scope 1 and 2, and increasingly scope 3. And I think the reason this is becoming top of mind for many people is that at EU level, most companies above 500 employees will be mandated to report their scope 1, 2, and 3 as of next year. So this is huge, concern a lot of people. And because scope 3 concerns supply chains, what that means is there's a trickle-down effect from any company to its supply chain. So you're mandated not just by law, but by the act of doing business with certain companies that say, well, I need to compute this. So if you're my supplier, please tell me what you're doing. And so the supplier of my suppliers end up reporting their carbon accounting. I'll stop there and give you back the floor.
Thank you. And perhaps you could go into a bit of detail around sort of why companies should be thinking about this. So you mentioned a bit there about the regulatory impacts, but equally, are you seeing employees more interested to work for companies who are doing carbon accounting? Are there unforeseen financial benefits, for instance? What's the kind of drivers there?
Well, let's just say that you used to be in a world where only the large enterprises that had the luxury of making ambitious pledges would do it, and you'd have Apple and Walmart and Procter and Gamble saying we're going to be net zero by 2030 or something. And so it was restricted in this old world. It was restricted basically to a group of experts, consultants, or in-house big company experts. And I think we've seen a real paradigm change. The regulations are more the result of that paradigm change, but essentially emissions tracking is, I think, becoming mainstream. You have the pressure of the regulation, but you have the pressure of the climate. People are realizing that today only about 25% of global emissions are being tracked and managed. And if we are to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030, you essentially need 100% of emissions being tracked and managed. So the regulations are pushing for this, but essentially companies are under the pressure of their investors. Maybe some people in this room are adding this criteria as part of their evaluations of their investments or their existing investments. The cost of capital is certainly increasingly tied to decarbonization, and especially in the private debt, private equity markets. You have pressure from your customers through the supply chain. You have pressure from the employees. And what that means is most functions in a particular company are feeling the pressure. CEOs used to think about top line only. It's becoming a branding thing. Do I survive as a business in a net zero world? Marketers, of course, used to think about personalization. Now it's all about, is my brand compatible with this new world? And if you're hiring millennials and young people, you see that whether their company have an impact or not is becoming a key criteria for choosing where to work. So students or new entrants on the job market are certainly a very powerful lobby with that respect. And maybe as investors, you're seeing that entrepreneurs want to work in this space too. So pressure is coming from all sides. And it's really making, I think, it's good news for us, but I think for the planet, our business pretty mainstream.
Okay, fantastic. A great context there. So I think, Rowena, coming to you now, say I'm an early stage company and I'm wanting to start on my carbon reporting journey. Kind of prior to actually pulling that data together and doing the analysis, what would your recommendations be to get that ball rolling?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Yeah, so I think I can't stress enough the need to work collaboratively on this with your peers and stakeholders. No one team holds all the information. No one team, in my opinion, can really do this alone. So I just really encourage that as a blanket statement before I go into. I've kind of looked at 6 different steps you can go into. I think, any questions at the end, totally happy to answer them. But really, I suppose I'm just encouraging, like off the back of what Alexis said, and just in terms of broader regulatory shifts, don't do nothing just because you can't do everything. So I think internal alignment as a first step and getting the leadership buy-in is really important. And, you know, before diving into data collection, it's about securing leadership buy-in from senior leadership, identifying your key stakeholders, leveraging the right fora, also to emphasize the importance of carbon reduction or greenhouse gas reduction. And so illustrate, I think, from both a business and a moral imperative, different levers are relevant for different actors and different stakeholders, but think about, you know, for example, how could you leverage a CEO to champion this in an all-staff meeting? But I think it's really also, I've seen where it's been really valuable to, of course, think about this and how it aligns with your company's values. How does it align with company strategy? And of course, again, kind of another blanket statement, but embedding this within the broader organization as part of a broader sustainability move. And then as a second point and as a second step, and then kind of back to, again, one of my earlier comments around cross-functional engagement. Again, not one team's going to hold all the data. Different departments do, operations, finance, procurement, engineering team. You need to foster that collaboration and alignment. And so I would really encourage that culture of cooperation and taking shared responsibility for these efforts, because if it sits with one team, it's often, you know, it's just better if everybody can help own this. And so before collecting data, one of the things that we've done in the past is to convene, to go to different teams meetings, for example, meet with them, speak with them about what's happening, seek their opinion. You can also, perhaps as part of a materiality assessment, also do a broader cross-functional workshop as well to help employees maybe do a brainstorming session around ideas where they might identify sources of emissions, or in turn even they may have ideas about where to reduce. And I think it's about taking your colleagues, and eventually, of course, external stakeholders too, if you go deeper into your supply chain, taking them on a journey. And then I think it's about being open and honest with them about where you are in this journey. So I don't think anybody expects you to have all the answers, and invariably we're not all sitting there being, you know, PhDs in scope 3 carbon accounting. So, but you don't need that. So I think work with what you have and work with the team. And I suppose then on that, a third step I was thinking around was education and awareness. You could conduct training sessions. You may not feel like you've got the expertise to do that, but there are lots of resources available, and I'm happy to share some as well. But around the significance, like what is climate change for some people, that might be like your starting point. You know, what impact does it have on me? If you can make that connection and also help people to understand what measures might they take in their day-to-day work to help you achieve the reduction that you're looking for. There are some low cost, no cost options through to bespoke options as well. And then I suppose step 4, I was saying from a data perspective, you're setting boundaries, setting scope. I think we're going to go into that more, but pulling data together, defining the scope, obviously key. But I think, again, rather than getting so complex, don't need to get overwhelmed, but starting simple. And being really clear on your boundaries, being clear on what you're including and why, being explicit around your assumptions and recording your methodology. In some places, of course, you need to actually disclose that anyway, but internally it helps you. And then establishing your baseline, identifying your data sources. So even that can be difficult. For example, having worked in a company where we didn't own our we were renting offices, just getting something like an electricity bill could actually be quite difficult. So knowing who's got the data and actually identifying where the data sits and with who. So really, again, building on the earlier engagement that you've created, collaborating with teams to ensure you've got the accuracy and completeness. In general, you're not going to necessarily understand the data to the degree that others may. Others may own the data and understand it way better than you can. So actually, that is where the collaboration is just so valuable. And then I'd say a last point in this is continuing to build relationships and motivating engagement as you go. So cultivate those relationships with data owners and the stakeholders, emphasize the benefits of carbon accounting, whether that's cost savings, reputation enhancement, whether it's with the people team talking about from a talent acquisition perspective, but I think trying to inspire people, enthuse them, and then really about then can come the kind of external points where you're highlighting your commitment as a company. But yeah, so they're kind of 5 very participatory steps I was thinking about, and they can really lay the foundations for a successful journey and to ensure that your data collection and your analysis efforts are well supported. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. And Karen, perhaps coming to you, I'm keen to get your kind of insight and reflection on those points. So kind of we've heard it in theory from Rowena, you've obviously done this in practice. Moneybox have been reporting this since 2019 now, and actually have reduced, I believe, your carbon emissions per employee by 14% over this time. So clearly have that traction and that collaboration. Could you possibly walk us through kind of what solutions you've used, what your experience has been, and how you've managed to get those right people engaged with making these reductions?
Yeah, I mean, if I may, I'll take it up a level before then. So Moneybox is a digital wealth manager based here in the UK. We, yes, have been carbon accounting for the last 5 years. And during that time, we've grown significantly. We're now a business of about 330 people. We've got about 1.4 million customers. We've got about £8 billion under administration across our various products. So saving, investing, a retirement, and we also offer a home buying service. And so we wanted to think about what becoming carbon neutral meant in the context of being a financial services business that wants to provide a great solution for our customers and really help them grow their wealth with confidence. And wrap around all of that. Moneybox has a very much a social purpose, and I think if you ask anyone why they join Moneybox, it would be really about making sure they can help deliver on our mission to be the best company in our field. Now, I think as we think about ESG in the broadest sense, Alexis talked about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We're UK based, we're digital, we don't have a deep supply chain, we don't mine, to state the obvious. And we are very, very limited in terms of scope 1 and 2, very, very limited. And I think in that context, why are we doing all this? And I think it really is because we want to make sure that we are reflecting the desires, ambitions, belief systems of our employees and our customers, and making sure that we can do our bit for societal improvements is very, very important to us. So whilst our direct impact is relatively low, this is a bit of a flagship initiative that we want to make sure that we're doing, and where we can seek to improve, we will. We are, one of our biggest investors is Fidelity, and that's why every year, on top of doing the carbon assessment, we also report through ESG-VC. So we've been doing that for the last few years as well. And I think it is interesting to look at how ESG-VC treats businesses like ours when looking at environmental, social and governance, because I do think particularly with these digital companies, particularly with these companies that are not based globally, there is a possible right sizing on what each of those pillars should mean in terms of what good looks like. I'm not going to open a can of worms there in terms of what does ESG mean and where do the pillars weight, because that could take us down a whole wormhole. But to come back, Emily, to your question in terms of what did we then do once we've decided this is something that we wanted to do. I mean, really, it's a lot of the stuff that Rowena was just talking about, making sure that this is something we talk about internally, something that people care about, something that they can really square into our belief system as a company, and fundamentally to get them involved. We've been working with this company Electro for the past 5 years now, and what they will do is they will send out a survey every single year, and it covers a specific period, and everyone in the employee base is asked to fill this in, and that will cover how you get to work, the equipment that you're using, whether you travel for work. We'll look at our facilities, so we'll look at everything from the coffee grains that we use to our printing, to our recycling, and so on. And that will get pulled into a report. We have this tracked on a platform, so we're able to look at where the variances have been and what's prompted that. And I think it will come as no surprise to know that, you know, the equivalent carbon emissions dropped notably over the pandemic. We were about I think we're about 36% of our equivalent emissions came from transport pre-pandemic, and we then dropped to, I think, lower than 20, and we're now back at about 25% of our proportion on the transport side of things. So, you know, that obviously is a key one. I think businesses that are allowing people to hybrid work, as we do, or indeed remote, are definitely saving in that department. Our other big areas are our operations and our facilities, you know, so our computer servers to our, as I said, you know, our coffees and our recycling and so on. But fundamentally, it's an education program. You know, we don't just go and outsource this and people put in a report and that's it. We make sure that we do a blog post on it every year. We make sure that there's an internal session every year. We've tied it in with Earth Day this year, and we're also showing a film about sustainability within the office. We've got a green team within the office who have just installed a load of I'm going to describe this wrongly, but air purifying plants in the office, just to make sure that, you know, even if we can't make the biggest impact, you know, we're not a car company or a coal miner, we are doing our bit.
Brilliant, thank you. And Alexi, maybe coming to you, and Karen alluded to it a little bit there with the sort of employee questionnaires and what you can be doing, you know, sort of shifting to that practicalities of the data collection. How do you think about that, and kind of what are the common difficulties that you maybe see, you know, once people have started to get that employee kind of activation with this, and it comes to actually getting that cold hard data? Could you just walk us through kind of what that looks like and any issues that you see commonplace with that?
Absolutely, and this is an important question, because the reason, you know, people haven't been doing this so much until recently is the data collection is the biggest pain point. You're essentially out there to map all the activities of a company, quantify them, and convert those activities into carbon. And so in the old world, so to speak, you had to do this with spreadsheets and collect, you know, basically map everything in a business. So what tech is meant to bring you as an advantage is essentially lowering that barrier to entry, saving time, making this more collaborative, etc. But to the point exactly, so it's 3 steps basically. Quantify your activities, convert that quantity into carbon, and then sum up all the activities along the framework scope 1, 2, and 3, which of course breaks down into sub categories. But to be a little more practical, so if you're tracking scope 1, for instance, you'd be looking at quantifying fuel consumptions, refrigerant gas for your ACs, and things like this. And of course, there's this, how do you convert fuel into carbon? Well, there is a physical quantity, or physical conversion factor. So burning 1 liter of fuel is typically 2.8 kilograms. So, you know, kilograms per liter of fuel is what we call an emission factor. So for all the activities that you quantify, you map this against emission factors. So just giving a few examples and then explaining how tech can help. If you're quantifying your scope 2, so typically essentially your electricity, well, that's rather easy. You count the kilowatt hours, right? But a kilowatt, so what's the footprint of a kilowatt hour? It's essentially the carbon intensity of the electricity. So let's say I consume 1,000 kilowatt hour a year. Well, if I'm in, let's say, Poland, It's a kilowatt hour is about 800 grams of CO2 because it's mostly powered by coal power plants. They had a strategic interest not to have Russian gas, basically. But if I am in Ireland, it might be 300 grams per kilowatt hour. And if I'm in Norway, it might be 30, and in France, 50. And so all these differences are due to the energy mix. So there are emission factors. And here you can use, most companies will say, okay, I've consumed 1,000 kilowatt hour of electricity a year. And on average, the average emission factor of electricity in France is 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So it's a very simple thing. What technology allows you to do is to automate the data collection of the electricity, because you have APIs that can help you connect to a utility, meter or so. And you can do this at a company level or at a meter level or even at a machine level, right? And so you tend to become quite granular. And then you also have APIs that give you the energy intensity of electricity. I mean, you have databases, open source database that give you the annual average, but you actually have APIs that give you the hourly average, because the energy intensity of electricity changes according to the wind and the sun. You know, the way electricity grid works is we push sun and wind power most first into the grid, but when the sun sets, basically, and people are still consuming, you open up other power plants, and you go from the greenest to the least green. And so, and maybe it's an overkill for a tech company to go down that grade, because your scope 2 is very minimal. But if you're a big consumer of energy, if you're an aluminum plant, let's say, or have a big factory or big offices, then you actually want that granularity, because that helps you decide when to consume energy. This whole concept that we're all familiar with of big workloads, basically. That's why we activate we charge our electric cars at night, or we use our washing machine at night. And so not to be too long on this, but then you have scope 3, which is much more difficult, because the access to the primary data is more difficult. So if I'm buying steel because I make automobile spare parts, I get the steel from China or from some other place, but so what I can do is and here typically you use two methodologies. One is called spend-based, which is very easy to deploy at scale, but is less accurate. And the other is called activity-based. So maybe, I'm spending 10 million a year, and I don't know where the biggest sources are, so I can automate a spend-based analysis. So I can have an API that integrates with my accounting. I can look at all my expenses, identify what they look like, and they will, on average, spending a million on steel is X amount of CO2. And what that allows you to do is to size things up. And you're going to say, well, my Nespresso capsules is actually 0.1% of my emissions using a spend-based approach. So maybe I don't need to count how many Nespresso capsules I drank, because even if I'm super accurate there, it's not really going to move the needle on my emissions. But let's say with a spend-based approach, I know that 50% more or less of my emissions are with my steel. Then actually, if I want to implement an action plan there, I'm much better off quantifying how many tons of steel rather than how much steel I'm buying, in which case you move to this activity-based approach. And here we're in an area where carbon accounting is a bit of a fractal topic, because you can say on average a ton of steel is something like 5 tons of CO2. But actually, if you're buying from China and it's linked to coal power, it might be 10. And if you're buying from Norway, where it's all mostly green energy sources, it might be 2 tons of CO2. So you have to, it never stops, basically, but you have to strike the right balance into which things. And now, as for the tech, we're talking about a lot of data. So what you need to do is have, when possible, APIs to input this data. When it's not possible, you basically have companies that dump big data, sources like inventories, bill of materials, things like this. And here you can actually start to have a little bit of AI by categorizing all those lines automatically and matching it with the right emission factor. So I hope I didn't lose my audience here. Maybe I'll say one more thing is, obviously, it's always interesting to be detailed on the largest single sources of your emissions. And these are very different from a sector to another. In aluminium, it's the electricity. In automobile, it's the steel, let's say, right? But here, I think a lot of people are investors in tech. So what about tech? So you have to be detailed and automate where it's the most important area. In tech, it tends to be your digital services and specifically your cloud computing, so scope 3. We have had a lot of customers in this field. And here is actually an interesting example because you can both automate and be very precise. You can sync up with an API from, say, an AWS or Azure or whatever, or Google, and you can have the minute level consumption of each instance, which are essentially computers, doing computations, and you can translate this into electricity. So our API automatically translates instance level consumption into kilowatt hours. And these kilowatt hours, as I was explaining previously, if you're still with me, we can translate automatically into electricity. And so it's quite beautiful, in fact, because you can be super precise. And what's the point? If cloud computing is your single biggest source of emissions, well, then you'd be interested to know which instance consumes the most when, so as to maybe rebalance which ones you're using versus the other. And you also be very interested in where your data sits. And to walk the talk at Greenly, like any startup, we started with Heroku, which is essentially AWS hosting data in Ireland, and it's 30 to 40% of our emissions. So we decided to migrate to Google because their data centers are mostly in France and Belgium. So at equivalent cost, we are not reducing so much our consumption of electricity through data centers because we're scaling, but we are dividing by 6, basically, the energy intensity, the carbon intensity of the electricity that results from our data centers. So I'm not, doing any ads for Google because there are data centers for other companies in France, but just the sheer fact of relocating the data changed our footprint by, we reduced by 5 our single biggest source of emissions, which is 30%. So our 30% is now equivalent of 6% of before. And that's how we actually reduced our emissions while growing as a company.
It's really interesting to hear how you're kind of actively reducing and the different steps that people consider to kind of do that. And I think it's nice to hear both you and Karen speak about that sort of specificity around, industry and companies, and that each individual company needs to kind of consider what their own emissions and what their largest are going to be, and then acting on those. Karen, you mentioned it being a tech company, and Alexis, you're mentioning with the cloud, and I think that's a really good takeaway for people to have. I think kind of going back to that decarbonisation point, and Rowena, coming to you for this, thinking about the longer term, once you're in a place where you've got that data together, as Alexis was speaking about, the position that Greenly's in, how can companies make that kind of next step about thinking about decarbonisation for themselves and translating this kind of whole data set back into actionable insights that they can take forward?
Yeah, I think Alexis already covered some of the points as well here. I mean, like setting clear goals, and I think, but you can't do that unless you really understand where are your emissions coming from. And as Alexis said again, knowing where there's the greatest intensity and making decisions around that aligned to clear goals. So yeah, setting clear goals, absolutely. Identifying, then go about identifying key areas of improvements. And I think that comes from really understanding where your emissions are across the are they your operations, supply chains, where in your products and services are they? And by identifying those, you can really start to prioritize where you can make the most significant efforts or impact, sorry. And then I think as well, you're looking again at employee engagement. I always think that the human side of this data collection is just so important. You think about how you can harness their engagement. How can you involve them at all levels in the reduction efforts as well? Because yeah, somebody owns this data. I think, you know, when we're talking about cloud, and this is something we've done in the past, but again, you know, understanding the architecture, you can't do that without engaging your engineering team. You know, many engineering teams have their data spread across multiple different cloud providers. So actually, you know, even being able to map it can be complicated but if you've got the right team, you've got the right teams involved from the very start, that's absolutely key. So I think again, so that's another area, that employee engagement. And then I think again, kind of back to the point I made before, is about monitoring and reporting on the progress, continually stating your assumptions as well. So establishing robust monitoring mechanisms to track the progress towards your emissions reduction goals over time. You know, I'm sure some of this data is sitting on an Excel spreadsheet somewhere in some organizations, but again, there are obviously these tech solutions, which certainly makes it easier when you're thinking about the conversion factors. And then I think you regularly reporting on your achievements, your challenges, continually bringing it back to fora where staff can hear and understand what's happening, to really foster transparency, foster accountability. Because if you want to get people involved, just asking them for data is not going to work, and then telling them, you know, your carbon scope 1, 2, 3 is not enough. So I think really trying to tell that story as you go through. Thanks.
If I just can add a quick thing. So obviously we want to reduce, but it's important to set expectations in terms of what can be achieved. You know, I think we went from a vision that was relatively immature, saying, hey, I'm carbon neutral, which is okay. I took a snapshot of my emissions and I'm buying offsets, and so problem solved. And this vision is still prevalent in many places. And sometimes talking to investors and presenting what Greenly is, I get people saying, "Oh, so you're an offset company," and I'm deeply shocked by this when they tell me this. But I understand it's a view that's very strong, especially in North America. And that's fine. But the reason it doesn't work is, you know, climate change is not a quick fix. And as you've certainly seen, there were suspicions around the quality of certain offset, hence rating agencies and so on. And just there aren't enough offsets worldwide to cover for every company's emissions. So if every company just tried to do this, it wouldn't work. It would just, it wouldn't fix the problem. It would inflate the cost of offsets, creating market incentives, but not enough to fix the problem. So it's really about the reduction, but the reduction is not getting to zero like next year. It's about aligning your company's trajectory with essentially the pathway laid out by the Paris Agreement. So we're talking about getting to a reduction of 50% by 2030. Net zero is in 2050. So personally, I'll be 70. You know, there's a little bit of time to get there, and what the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says, it's not the same pathway for reduction for every business. You know, we'll still be having food in 2050. Maybe we'll be consuming less fossil fuel. So it's more or less 15% reduction per year in super heavy intensive businesses, and rather like 4% a year for low intensity businesses. So reducing emissions by 4 or 5% when you're a service or a tech company is really not that hard. And I think it's important to emphasize this because people tend to get discouraged before they start. And I think one of you said you had reduced your emissions by 14%. So, you know, it's more than that target. And there are standards for setting targets, one of them being science-based targets initiatives, if some of you have heard of it.
Great. So I think we have a couple of minutes left for Q&A, so pop them in the box. We do have one through at the moment. And Karen, perhaps if I come to you for this one. So it's around how kind of PE firms, but I'll extrapolate it to VC firms as well, can kind of meet regulatory requirements when they have a private portco, so getting the data from those private companies. And Karen, I guess flipping it on its head a bit, you're in the position of being a private company. What's encouraged you to kind of give data to your investors, I guess, and how would you recommend investors go about kind of getting that information out from the companies that they invest into?
Hey, without being blunt, we do most things that our investors asked us to do in terms of information requirements. It's certainly our intention and desire to be as collaborative as possible. In terms of what would help, I mean, I referenced it earlier in terms of the ESG VC requests, but making sure that we understand the context of the request. So why is this being done? What are other companies doing? What does the collective feedback look like? And what are they, the funds striving to achieve with it, is incredibly helpful. There's a lot of work that goes into preparing these sorts of questionnaires. We have a number that come in every year and none of them are consistent. They all are slightly different questions. So yes, we can have a data set pulled together and we have that relatively easily, but it always needs to be cut in a different way. So I think purely on the work being done and making sure that we understand what the output is helpful, but also I think in giving us the context for what they need, why, what they're striving to achieve, we can hopefully make sure that the questionnaires that are sent through are curated in such a way or specific in such a way that they do understand the sort of where. I mean, we've done sort of scored very, very highly in all the ones that we've done, but I think necessarily our lower score would be on E, and that's not because we are heavy pollutants at all. It's because we're actually low pollutants. So actually, the efforts that we're taking to mitigate are less significant. So I think there is a big one around context, and then actually I think that and obviously I'm speaking at the very different end of the scale in terms of negative impact to the sorts of companies that Alexis was speaking about a moment ago. But Rowena, when we had a pre-call on this topic, you spoke about kind of doing this materiality assessment, which I think is really critical. Not all businesses will be able to make a material impact on their ESG strategy through reduction of carbon emissions. 14% of a small amount is very different from 2% of a much larger amount. So actually, I think the VC looking at their portfolio and saying which one of our companies hits the E, the S, the G, where realistically are efforts going in to improve, going to make a material change on the whole unit.
Could I jump in and add to that, Karen? Because so much of what you said resonated. And just to say that a previous company where I was engaging with the investors on behalf of the company, I really appreciated the opportunity to be able to just sit and talk to them. We had like an hour and a half's discussion around the ESG questionnaire. And I really, as you kind of mentioned, being able to discuss the context of it and actually feedback on some of the indicators and some of the KPIs that they were requesting, and it's being able to explain. And actually, off the back of it, we were able to adjust one of those, and it made it way more relevant for not only us but for other companies in their portfolio too. So yeah, just that open conversation was hugely valuable.
Fantastic. Alexis, any final thoughts from you?
Well, again, trying to target the talking points to the audience a little. What we've seen, is pressure coming from all sides, but I would emphasize specifically the pressure coming from the investor community. In financing, so essentially investments are tomorrow's emissions, because when you do track the carbon footprint of an investment fund, It's essentially by looking at where the money goes, right? And there are specific methodologies on this, PCAF and so on. And what this reflects is we've seen very smart ways to use the money to push companies to decarbonize. So I'll give you 3 examples and quickly, right? Not to take too much time. One is we have this partnership with BNPP and now HSBC, whereby they push SMBs to disclose their emissions. And how do they push them at BNPP? They reduce the interest rate. So since the companies that they lend to are part of their scope 3, they want the companies that they lend to reduce their emissions. So when you finance an energy company like BP, Shell, or Total, it makes sense to disengage yourself from these companies so that your financed emissions really lower. But you can also do this with the small companies by essentially giving them an interest rate premium on their reduction. We have seen this logic play at larger scale with private equity companies who have net zero fund. There are a couple out there. And so basically the companies have covenants in their contract that essentially give them an interest rate premium as well, according to their decarbonization strategy. And so we have seen CFOs be dead serious about the reduction because they saw the cost of increasing. And we have even seen partners of these net zero funds be extremely serious about the emissions reduction because they're carried were linked to their portfolio companies hitting SBTi targets. And to be honest, I have never seen companies more committed to decarbonization when partners had their carry tied to decarbonization. So I really encourage you guys to put this in place in your respective organizations.
Fantastic. Okay, so I think that just about wraps us up. It's been fantastic hearing from you all, and thank you so much again for your time. A lot to learn and digest that, and a lot for the industry to continue doing. I think, Rowena, you said at the beginning that don't do nothing just because you can't do everything, and that's definitely something that I'll be taking away. I think for those interested in learning any more, we'll definitely share out a follow-up, which will signal some key resources, and if you'd like to kind of learn more about what we've been discussing today. And equally, if there's future webinars that you'd like ESGVC to be looking at hosting, please do let myself or Henry know. And equally, one final plug from me, please follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date with our news, research, and our resources. But thanks again, everyone, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.